Well, you have my name, which is Anne, and I'll put in my second name, Rabina, from my grandmother, Guglo, nee Austin, and I came to Canberra in 1941, just before Easter, actually. We lived for a little while with the Dunn family at Kingston. Housing was very short. And then we got a house at 27 Westlake, which is just over there. And I lived there with the family. I had to go to Sydney Teachers College, but basically we left in 1959. So that's me. Westlake was isolated. It was one of the temporary settlements, and I now know was designed by Rowland, H.M. Rowland. And the first cottage was built there in 1924. It was actually the first cottages built for construction workers. And the settlement had 61 houses. And it wasn't until I began to research that I realised that it was part of a much bigger settlement in the 20s when the Provisional Parliament House, etc., was being constructed. But as the cottages, as people left in the late 1950s and 60s, our cottages were sold and moved, and Robert Bowden, who was the Botanical Gardens, helped a mate move one of them. And I forgot, Robert said it went down to the south coast. But there are a number in Queanbeyan and in River Street Oaks Estate. There's one. I'm not sure if it's a Westlake one or an Acton one. Now, they were also painted green. And I met, it was an Oaks Estate person, I can't remember his first name. Yeah, Robinson. But he said, you know, I said, why green? It was to blend in with the landscape, to hide them. People who had no business in Westlake didn't come there. You didn't go through. Canberra was a class thing. And if you were a public servant or what have you transferred here, you normally were moved into the permanent suburbs. And you even had the ability to buy your cottage for the cost of the construction over a 30-year period and so on. And you even got freebie stuff from the nursery to plant your hedges and so on. We had none of that, and the area, the isolation, the cottages were unlined and so on, they were cold. Now the other ones that fitted into this same picture were Causeway and Molonglo, the ex-internment camp that was converted into cottages in the 20s. There were also the single man's Capitol Hill camp, Causeway camps and so on. And if you came from those places, particularly I went to Tilapia Park Infants and Primary, as most of the kids did, or St Christopher's. No, none went to grammar. But I went to Canberra High School in the high school years, which was a selective high. And I stepped out of class. If I hadn't been very shy, it would have been perhaps all right. But I can remember one girl, and I won't mention her name, but she used to put me down all the time. I was teased and bullied. It was not nice. But it turns out later, she lived at Westridge, which is Yarralumla, but it turns out later on she was actually born at number 17 Westlake, and I think, look, if you were here today, my dear, I would tell you.
I was born Gail Johnston here in the Canberra Hospital, and I lived in Westlake, and I later married, and my name is now Gail Mooney. I moved to Acton when my father died when I was 9, so we moved over just after that, when they were pulling Westlake down. They were cottages there for the workmen. So yes, we moved across to Acton and moved into number 8, and right next door to Mrs. Llewellyn and Jan, my friend Jan, so it's really great. I lived here for about 4 years. It wasn't any longer than that. Again, they were pulling the Acton cottages down then to make way for the lake. So we left Westlake because of the lake, because we had the river in the middle, the Molonglo River, and then we moved across here, and then we had to move again to O'Connor in the end. I didn't feel like we were the little cottages and they were that. No, I never really felt inferior to it at all. We're like over in Westlake, living at Westlake, you certainly did. There was great discrimination. Oh, huge. not very nice at all, because they were underlying green timber cottages. And they were but the sad thing was that they were the workmen's cottages. These were the people who helped build Canberra. But yeah, it was great. You were really very much discriminated living there. But over here, again, see, that all left us over here at Acton. And as I said to you, that what I loved most of all was having that privilege to be horse riding and part of it all, and integrating with children who were, had the best of everything. But they didn't. They just treated us normally because we were all riding horses together. So there was no discrimination. We were all one. It was like you had one uniform, and we're all one.
My name's John Clary. I was born at the Canberra Community Hospital across the lake there in 1953. My grandfather came, he was working on the old Parliament House, and then when he brought his family here in 1924, they lived a little bit further over my shoulder on the other side of the river in Westlake, and they were there until about 1930, and my grandfather was very involved with the Catholic Church, and so he spent a lot of time at the Acton Hall and building the first tabernacle and altar there, and they used to come here to Mass, obviously, and so they had a long association with the area. He was born in 1876 in Braidwood, and him and his brother Phil became carpenters, and so they lived in that area, and eventually they moved to Canberra, and he was working on the first Parliament House, and he was a foreman carpenter on Parliament House. And there's a few stories about him, how he used to live at, the family were at Reedsdale. His wife and kids lived out there while he was working, and he lived in the tradesman's camp, which is not far over my right shoulder. And and he used to ride back to Reedsdale every second weekend, which was about 63 miles. And so what he used to do is on a Sunday night he'd leave Reedsdale about 9 p.m. and apparently he used to get here quite early in the morning, and so he'd have a rest. What he said was he had a rest under the trees at Acton before starting work on the Monday morning. So then in March 1924 the family moved to Westlake, which would be over my left shoulder, and they were the first family to move into there, and they were number 16 Westlake. And my father was about 18 months old when they moved there, and we've lived in Canberra ever since, the Clary side of the family.
The boys from Westlake used to frequent the Royal Canberra Golf Club, and if they came over our side of the river, then they used to get stoned, and likewise with us. And of course, if we used to stray into the territory of the boys from Turner, there was a bit of trouble. But it was all friendly, sort of friendly stuff, well, half friendly.